Hey everyone, in this video we're going to learn how we can make this pattern, popularly known as 10 print. Now this pattern is quite famous in the world of creative coding due to the fact that it was created using one line of code in a language called BASIC. And the code was written such that each time the program ran, the pattern was different, making it a generative pattern. So we're going to be looking at how we can write a similar code for that today. Now before we get started with the coding itself, let's take a look at the pattern. On looking at the pattern, we can see that it's actually split into a simple XY grid. Now we know that we can achieve this using the nested loop like we have in the previous video. Now inside each grid is a diagonal line. It randomly goes either from top left to bottom right or top right to bottom left. This seems to be randomly selected. So we can achieve this by using the random function and an if loop. So now we know the steps that we need to do. First we need to create a grid, then we need to add lines inside that grid, and then we need to be able to randomly select the direction of the line. So now we can get started with the coding. Now one thing to remember while programming larger projects is that we need to think of what all the steps are before we rush into the code. Thinking of the steps first will help us write the code in a more structured and planned way. And typically it's faster if we actually spend some time planning and then write the code rather than writing the code direct. Okay. So first let's make a grid with ellipses that are maybe 50 units in width and height. And it starts at the top left point of 25, 25, so that when it's placed 50 units apart, we get 8 ellipses in one row. So to do that, first let's declare a variable x and write a for loop that has x starting from 25. It goes till 400, where x increases by 50 each time, since that's the width of the ellipse that we want. And we'll just draw an ellipse at x comma 25 because y is going to be constant. With the width and a height of 50. Let's see what we have. Okay, perfect. Now let's try and see if we can write all this 50 and 25 in terms of a variable. So what we'll do is we'll say size and we'll initialize size to 50. So all of these 50s over here are basically were indicative of the width. So we can change it to the variable since that's what this indicates as well. And we can even change the starting point to size divided by 2 because essentially the center point is half of the width of the ellipse. So we can change the starting point to size by 2. And the first row will also have a y value of size divided by 2. Perfect. So now what will happen is if we reduce the size to say 20, we'll get multiple ellipses without having to change much of the code. We just have to change this variable. So I'm going to make it 40 now and leave it at that. Now let's write a nested loop so that just like how x is changing, y can also change, and then we can change this value to that variable. So I'm going to create another variable y. Now you can actually declare multiple variables like this. Like instead of saying let x and let y, you can also write let x comma y. Okay, so here I'm going to say y equals size divided by 2. So since the grid is a square, these values will actually end up being the same. Y equals y plus size. Now you'll notice we keep tabbing our code sometimes. That's just to make it look neat so that we understand, okay, this is inside this and this for loop is inside this for loop. If you ever get confused about how to tab, you can go to edit and say tidy code and it'll automatically tab it for you. Okay, now we've written the next for loop as well. So let's change this y value inside the ellipse to the variable y. There we go, we have a complete grid. So step 1 is done. Step 1 of this project was to create a grid. That's complete. Next step was to draw diagonal lines inside each of the grid. So to do that, we can essentially comment out this ellipse. Now let's look at a single grid. what do we know about the grid? We know the center point of every grid as x and y. So that means the top left point will basically be x minus size by 2 and y minus size by 2, and the bottom right will be x plus size by 2 and y plus size by 2. So now that we know the 2 points, we can just write the line as x minus size divided by 2, and the y will be y minus size divided by 2. The point that it connects to, the second point, will be x plus size by 2 and y plus size divided by 2. Perfect. So because there's a line on each grid, it looks pretty continuous right now. But that's our second step. That's also complete. The last and final step was to randomly choose between a line that goes from left to right or a line that goes from top right to bottom left. To do that, we need to be able to make a choice in the first place. So for that, I'm just going to create a variable called choice, initialize it to 0 for now, and within the for loop, I'm going to say choice equals random 0 to 1. So now choice can be any value between 0 to 1, including all the decimal numbers in between. So what we'll do is we'll say if choice is less than 0.5, we will draw the diagonal line that we have right now. So if the choice is less than 0.5, we are drawing the line from top left to bottom right. Else, which means if the choice is greater than 0.5, we want to draw a line in the opposite direction. So for the line in the opposite direction, the 2 points will be, the top right will be x plus size by 2 and y minus size by 2. The bottom left will be x minus size by 2 and y plus size divided by 2. Okay, let's run this. So as you can see, it's really fast right now, but what's actually happening is every time in the draw loop, it's creating a new pattern for us to see. It's happening so fast that we're not able to differentiate. So let's go ahead and reduce the frame rate to 2. There we go. So what's happening is every time the draw loop runs, it's generating a new pattern, because this entire loop will run every time you come into the draw loop, and every time this loop runs, you get a new pattern. So we can even go ahead and make the pattern a lot more complicated now by reducing this value size that we had created initially. If we make the size 20, there you go. We've created the 10 print pattern. So this pattern is very interesting, and remember, we are using 23 lines of code, but when this was made before, it was made with 1 line of code. And every time you wanted a new pattern there, you had to sort of run the code again. It wasn't animated in the way it is for us, but still, it's very impressive that we can combine that logic into just one simple line of code. So this is the basic 10 print, but you can go ahead and play around more with it, right? You can change the line thickness, you can change the shapes even. Maybe it's not always 2 lines, maybe it's 2 triangles that you get each time. So if you play around with 10 print, you can actually get patterns that look a bit different but follow the same logic, like this or like this. So go ahead and play around with this code. You can find the code that we've written in the description below as well, so you can take it from there, change the values and experiment and see what happens. So have fun, and we're excited to see what you make. Thank you.